good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Lately, a couple of people have asked me, what do you think about the relationship between the church and the state and how that affects the individual believer? Do we as Christians have any special duty to the state? And if so, how does that work? What if there's a conflict between the church and the state? And, I think this is sometimes a challenging issue to address because it's not really something that most churches talk about or address very systematically, if they address it at all. Now, I wish I could say that to answer this question, I went and did an exhaustive study of the scriptures so that I could give you a comprehensive and thoroughly biblical answer. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that to do that study and to really do it justice, to really do it right, would take several man-years of effort. And I'm not in a position to do that right now with the demands that are currently placed on my time. So maybe later in life I can tackle that project if the Lord wills. But for now, the best I can do is give you a series of principles that I've drawn from my existing knowledge of Scripture and that I think do provide at least a starting point for understanding this issue. And I've got a cheat sheet here where I wrote down the principles that I came up with. So I've got 6 general principles and a handful of subpoints. So principle number 1. Under the law of Moses, aka the Old Covenant, God's covenant was with the nation of Israel. So in the Old Testament, there was no separation of church and state. They were one combined entity. Now, under the law of Moses, this combined church-state entity was responsible for a variety of functions. First off, spiritual leadership of the nation, teaching people right from wrong, teaching morality as delineated in the law of Moses, but also they were responsible for civil law enforcement. The priesthood, in many respects, held supreme judicial authority under the law of Moses. Of course, they were responsible for organizing national defense, any kind of warfare or military operations. They were also responsible for administering what we would now call a system of social welfare. The priests were authorized to collect a tithe, basically 10% of agricultural produce, from which they would be supported themselves. And then they were also to distribute a portion of that to widows, orphans, people who genuinely couldn't support themselves in that society. Of course, that brings up the issue of taxation. Obviously they were empowered to collect these tithes, as well as voluntary donations to support their work. And then they even served somewhat of a public health function. The priests, to a degree, were responsible for both the physical and spiritual health of the people. Now, principle number 2, under the new covenant, there is a separation between church and state because the church is a spiritual kingdom that transcends the boundaries of earthly kingdoms. Christ himself said, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, in Bible prophecy, we may look forward to a time when Christ will return to the earth and establish a physical kingdom here. Depending on your eschatological perspective, your interpretation of these prophecies, there are different perspectives on exactly how that's going to work out. But for now, I think there is a pretty general consensus among theologians that in this present age, the church is a spiritual kingdom that is and should be separate from the state. But principle number 3, even though the state is not party to the new covenant, it still has a God-given purpose in New Testament times, namely to suppress the physical expression of evil. And I'm basing that on the verse that says, he, in this context, a government official, basically, is God's minister unto thee, an avenger to execute wrath upon the children of disobedience. And that's a theme I think that's echoed a couple of places in the New Testament, that governing officials are ordained by God for that purpose. So that brings us to principle number 4, namely that the individual believer has a God-given responsibility to support both the church and the state in their respective God-given roles. And principle number 5, I would propose that, philosophically at least, there is no conflict between our respective duties to the church and to the state, because by God's design, those two entities serve distinctly separate functions. So looking back at our list of the functions of the church state in the Old Testament, in a New Testament context, we should be able to assign each of those functions to either the church or the state, but generally not both. And so, in a New Testament context, clearly civil law enforcement, national defense, military operations, that kind of thing is the purview of the state. Whereas spiritual leadership, teaching morality, proclaiming the Word of God is clearly under the purview of the church. Now, what about some of these other functions like social welfare or public health? Well, as I read the New Testament, it seems clear to me that the early church was heavily involved in charitable ministries. They took substantial responsibility for caring for the needy, especially within those churches, but even more generally in the communities where the church had a presence. So, based on this observation and the principle that the church and state have distinctly separate functions, I would suggest that practically all government welfare programs represent government overreach. Welfare and charitable programs absolutely are an important part of society, but they are the rightful function of the church, not of the state. And so the intrusion of the government into matters of charity and social welfare represents a usurpation of the church's God-given role. Now, how did we as a society get into this mess of government welfare? Was it initially the church that was shirking its charitable responsibilities and that prompted the government to step in and take up the slack? Or was it a gradual progression of government overreach into this area that eventually crowded the church out of being in a position to execute its charitable responsibilities effectively? Or were there other factors that, got us to where we are? You could probably argue that back and forth all day. And similarly, we read in the New Testament that if any of you is sick, let him call for the elders of the church. And so I would put matters of public health or medicine clearly within the purview of the church and not of the state. Which would lead me to speculate that there is probably a much closer connection between physical and spiritual health than most modern-day Christians recognize or fully appreciate. And finally, what about the authority to collect money from people? This might be a slight exception to the principle of separation of powers between church and state, because Christ famously said, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. As well as, just from a practical standpoint, the government obviously needs some form of income in order to execute its God-given duties for law enforcement and national defense. And so if they don't get that money from taxation, then they'll have to collect it through fines and penalties and other things that probably offer an even greater potential for abuse than, equitable taxation would. So I think it's safe to say that taxation in some form is well within the scope of the state's God-given authority. That said, we also see in the church that professional ministers were in general to be supported financially by the church, as well as the church would obviously need resources with which to pursue its charitable endeavors. So the church also clearly needs a source of income. Now that said, recall that in the Old Testament, the priests received both the mandatory tithe and also voluntary donations. And so if we want to maintain a clean separation of powers in the New Testament, we could argue that the state inherited the right to collect mandatory taxes, and the church inherited the right to collect voluntary donations. And I think that's consistent with what's been taught in most of the churches, at least that I've been in over the years, that even though they refer to the money that they collect as tithes and offerings, they only want voluntary donations. They're involved in trying to do the work of God as best they know how, and if you want to contribute to that monetarily, they'll do the best they can to put that money to good use, but they don't want anyone giving for the wrong motives or out of a sense of obligation. So that's my initial take on the ideal separation of powers between the church and the state. But as we've seen, that ideal separation is not always exactly what works out in practice. And so that kind of brings us to principle number 6. Namely, God establishes and deposes governments at will. And so, if God revokes the governing authority of one entity and gives it to another, then the believer within that jurisdiction is duty-bound to support whatever government God has ordained. So, in the case of this country, 200 and some odd years ago, our founding fathers perceived that God had stripped governing authority for the colonies away from the King of England and given it to them. Now, how exactly did they know that? Well, that could be the topic of a long discussion or a separate video, and I'm not sure I really have a definitive answer to that question. I will say that it seems reasonable to suppose that if a given governing entity is not fulfilling its God-given role, namely to suppress the physical expression of evil, particularly if it comes to the point of promoting evil and persecuting righteousness, then it seems reasonable to suppose that God would eventually depose that government and replace it with one that would fulfill its God-given purpose. But then, on the other hand, God is notoriously patient even with governments who have at times persecuted his people. And so I don't think there's really any simple formula for figuring out exactly when God would depose a given government or who he would replace it with. So if you should happen to find yourself in a situation where civil war has broken out and you're trying to determine whether a given faction is a new government that God is raising up, or whether they're just a bunch of sinners who are rebelling against the government that God has ordained, all I can really tell you is pray for wisdom and discernment, because you're going to need it. And the Bible does assure us that God will answer prayers for wisdom and discernment. So I think that concludes my initial off-the-cuff treatment of this question of the relationship between church and state and the individual believer. Hopefully this discussion was helpful to some of you out there. And until next time, Thank you for watching The Idahoan Show.